Welcome back to the channel. If you love uncovering the forgotten stories of the past, you're in the right place. Today we're drifting back nearly 2,000 years to explore one of history's most fascinating military mysteries: how just 40,000 Roman soldiers managed to conquer an island of nearly 2 million Britons in 43 AD. At the time, Britain was a land of powerful tribes, fierce warriors, and ancient traditions. Yet when the disciplined legions of the Roman Empire arrived, everything began to change. In this video we'll explore the political intrigue behind the invasion, the strategy of the Roman legions, the fierce resistance of the British tribes, and the battles that ultimately reshaped the destiny of an entire island. Before we begin the journey, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the most incredible stories from history. Now, let's step back in time to the year 43 AD and discover how the Roman Empire began its conquest of Britain. Long before the legions of the Roman Empire set foot on its shores, the island of Britain stood as one of the most mysterious lands in the ancient world. To the people of the Mediterranean, it was a distant and mist-covered place lying far beyond the familiar borders of civilization. Sailors spoke of it as a land where dense forests stretched for miles, rivers wound through wild landscapes, and powerful tribes ruled territories that had never been conquered by any foreign empire. From the perspective of Rome, Britain was not simply another land across the sea, it was the very edge of the known world. By the 1st century AD, Britain was home to a population estimated at nearly 2 million people. These inhabitants were not part of a single nation. Instead, they were divided into dozens of Celtic tribes, each controlling its own territory and led by powerful chieftains or kings. Among them were tribes like the Catuvillani, the Trinovantes, and the Iceni. Each tribe had its own customs, alliances, and rivalries. They lived in hill forts and settlements scattered across the countryside, surrounded by farmland, woodland, and open plains where livestock grazed. Their societies were deeply connected to the rhythms of nature, and their spiritual life revolved around sacred groves, rivers, and the teachings of their priestly class known as the Druids. The Druids were among the most respected figures in British society. They served not only as religious leaders but also as judges, scholars, and keepers of tribal knowledge. Their teachings were passed down orally, and they played an important role in maintaining traditions and guiding tribal leaders. In a land without written laws or centralized government, the authority of the Druids helped maintain order among the tribes. They oversaw rituals, interpreted omens, and acted as mediators in disputes between rival groups. Despite their cultural unity as Celtic peoples, the tribes of Britain rarely acted as a single force. Each tribe focused primarily on its own survival and prosperity. Alliances were often temporary and could shift quickly depending on political circumstances. A tribe that was an ally one year might become an enemy the next. Warfare between tribes was not uncommon. Battles were fought for land, prestige, and influence, and successful leaders could gain power by expanding their territories or defeating rival chiefs. The warriors of Britain were famous for their bravery and ferocity. Ancient writers described them as tall, strong fighters who often charged into battle with fierce determination. Some warriors painted their bodies with blue dye made from a plant called woad, creating a terrifying appearance meant to intimidate their enemies. Others wore elaborate Torx metal neck rings that symbolized status and courage. Their weapons included long slashing swords, spears, and oval shields decorated with intricate designs. One of the most distinctive features of British warfare was the use of chariots. Unlike the massive war chariots used in some ancient civilizations, British chariots were light and fast, built for speed and mobility. A skilled warrior could ride across the battlefield while his charioteer maneuvered the vehicle through enemy lines. The warrior would leap from the chariot to fight on foot, then jump back aboard to reposition or pursue fleeing enemies. This style of combat was both dramatic and effective, especially against opponents unfamiliar with such tactics. Yet even with their courage and skill in battle, the tribes of Britain lacked something that would prove crucial when facing a powerful empire like Rome: unity. Each tribe acted independently, and while they might unite temporarily against a common threat, long-term cooperation was rare. Political rivalries and competition for resources often prevented them from forming a lasting alliance. Across the sea, the Romans had been aware of Britain for centuries. Merchants and traders had long traveled between the island and the European mainland, exchanging goods such as metals, grain, livestock, and luxury items. British tin was particularly valuable, as it was an important component in the production of bronze. Roman traders also brought wine, pottery, jewelry, and other goods that were highly prized by British elites. Through these trade connections, Roman leaders gained valuable knowledge about the island and its people. They learned about the tribes, their territories, and their political rivalries. They also discovered that while Britain had many resources and a large population, it lacked a centralized authority capable of organizing the entire island into a single defensive force. The first Roman leader to seriously attempt an invasion of Britain was Julius Caesar. In 55 BC, during his campaigns in Gaul, Caesar decided to launch an expedition across the sea. His initial landing was more of a reconnaissance mission than a full conquest. Roman soldiers encountered fierce resistance from British warriors who gathered along the shoreline to oppose them. Despite these challenges, Caesar managed to establish a foothold and gather valuable intelligence about the island. The following year, Caesar returned with a larger force. This second expedition penetrated deeper into British territory and forced several tribes to submit to Roman authority, at least temporarily. However, Caesar never intended to remain permanently in Britain. His primary goal was to demonstrate Roman power and secure political prestige back in Rome. After achieving these objectives, he withdrew his forces, leaving Britain independent once again. Even though Caesar did not conquer the island, his expeditions left a lasting impression on both sides. For the Romans, Britain became a place of fascination and opportunity. It was seen as a land rich in resources and potential wealth. For the tribes of Britain, Caesar's invasions were a warning that powerful forces beyond the sea could one day return. Over the following decades, contact between Britain and the Roman world continued to grow. Trade expanded, and some British leaders began to adopt elements of Roman culture. Roman goods became symbols of prestige among tribal elites, and diplomatic relationships developed between certain tribes and Roman authorities. In some cases, rival British leaders even sought Roman support in their struggles for power. These connections gradually brought Britain closer to the influence of the Roman world, even without direct conquest. Yet the island remained politically fragmented. Powerful tribes competed for dominance, and ambitious leaders sought to expand their control over neighboring territories. Among the most influential of these tribes was the Catuvellauni, which rose to prominence in southeastern Britain during the early 1st century AD. Under strong leaders, they expanded their power and absorbed or subdued neighboring tribes. Their growing dominance began to reshape the political landscape of the region. As these struggles unfolded within Britain, the Roman Empire was entering a new phase of expansion and consolidation. Emperors sought to strengthen their authority through military victories and territorial gains. Conquering new lands not only brought wealth and resources but also reinforced the prestige of the emperor and the empire itself. By the time the Roman Emperor Claudius came to power in AD 41, the idea of conquering Britain had once again gained momentum in Roman political circles. Claudius had risen to the throne under unusual circumstances and faced skepticism from many members of the Roman elite. A successful military campaign could silence his critics and prove his strength as a ruler. Britain seemed like the perfect target. It was close enough to reach with a large army, yet distant enough that a successful conquest would appear bold and impressive. The island was rich in agricultural land and natural resources. Most importantly, it was divided among many tribes that often fought each other instead of uniting against external threats. To Roman strategists, this division presented a significant advantage. Instead of facing a single unified enemy, Roman forces could confront each tribe individually. Some tribes might resist fiercely, while others might choose to cooperate with Rome in exchange for protection or political advantage over their rivals. The Romans were masters of this strategy. Throughout their history, they had repeatedly used diplomacy, alliances, and manipulation to weaken their enemies before launching military campaigns. By exploiting rivalries and offering favorable terms to certain groups, they could turn potential enemies into allies. For Britain, this combination of internal division and external ambition would soon lead to a dramatic turning point. The island that had long existed beyond the reach of Roman power was about to become the focus of one of the empire's most ambitious invasions. At the moment when the Roman legions prepared to cross the sea, Britain remained a land of proud tribes, ancient traditions, and fierce independence. Its forests echoed with the sounds of tribal gatherings and the rituals of the Druids. Its warriors still believed that their courage and numbers could defend their homeland against any invader. But across the waters of the English Channel a different kind of power was assembling. Roman legions, trained with relentless discipline and guided by experienced commanders, were preparing for a campaign that would change the history of the island forever. The stage was set for a confrontation between two very different worlds. On one side stood the tribal societies of Britain, brave and numerous but divided by rivalries and competing ambitions. On the other side stood the Roman Empire, an organized military machine capable of projecting its power across continents. Within a few years, the meeting of these two forces would transform Britain in ways its inhabitants could scarcely imagine. Cities would rise where tribal settlements once stood. Roads would cut through forests and fields. Forts and walls would mark the expansion of Roman authority across the landscape. But at this moment, before the invasion began, Britain was still a free land, vast, wild, and unconquered. Its people lived according to traditions that had endured for generations, unaware that the arrival of the Roman legions would soon begin a new chapter in the story of their island. By the early 1st century AD, the political center of the Mediterranean world was firmly under the authority of the Roman Empire, a vast power that stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of northern Europe. Its influence reached across 3 continents, and its legions had conquered countless peoples. Yet even in such a powerful empire, the stability of the throne was never guaranteed. Emperors rose and fell through intrigue, ambition, and political maneuvering. It was in this uncertain environment that a man named Claudius unexpectedly found himself at the center of Roman power. Claudius had never seemed destined to rule. Born in 10 BC into the prestigious Julio-Claudian dynasty, he was the grandson of the great Roman leader Mark Antony and closely related to the imperial family that had governed Rome since the days of Augustus. Despite this impressive lineage, Claudius spent most of his life on the margins of political life. Ancient sources describe him as a man who suffered from various physical ailments, including a limp and a speech impediment. Because of these conditions, many members of the Roman elite considered him weak and unfit for public office. As a result, Claudius grew up largely excluded from the traditional path of Roman political advancement. While other members of the imperial family gained fame through military commands and public leadership, Claudius devoted his time to scholarly pursuits. He became deeply interested in history, language, and literature. He even wrote detailed works about Roman history and the cultures of neighboring peoples. Although these intellectual achievements demonstrated his intelligence, they did little to improve his reputation among those who valued military strength and political authority above all else. For many years, Claudius remained an overlooked member of the imperial household. Yet fate would eventually place him on the throne through one of the most dramatic political crises in Roman history. In AD 41, the Emperor Caligula was assassinated by members of his own guard. Caligula had ruled Rome with increasing instability and cruelty, alienating both the Senate and the military. His death created a sudden power vacuum that threatened to plunge the empire into chaos. Senators briefly considered restoring the old Roman Republic, hoping to remove the system of emperors altogether. But the Roman army had different plans. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for protecting the emperor, quickly moved to secure control of the situation. During the confusion following Caligula's assassination, they discovered Claudius hiding in the palace, reportedly terrified that he might also be targeted by the conspirators. Recognizing his connection to the imperial family, the guards proclaimed him emperor and escorted him to their camp, where he accepted their support. With the backing of the Praetorian Guard, Claudius became the new ruler of the Roman Empire. However, his sudden rise to power left many members of the Roman Senate deeply skeptical. To them, Claudius was not a strong leader but an unlikely figure elevated by the military. They doubted his ability to command the respect of the legions or maintain control over such a vast empire. In the political culture of Rome, reputation mattered enormously. Emperors were expected to demonstrate strength, authority, and success, especially through military achievements. Great rulers like Augustus had secured their legitimacy through victories on the battlefield and the expansion of Roman territory. Without similar accomplishments, Claudius risked being viewed as a weak and temporary ruler. Claudius understood this challenge very well. Although he was known more for his scholarship than his military experience, he was far from foolish. He recognized that if he wanted to secure his position and silence his critics, he would need to achieve something spectacular, something that would prove his ability to lead the empire. The solution, in his mind, lay across the sea. The island of Britain had long captured the imagination of Roman leaders. For centuries, it had existed on the edge of Roman knowledge, a distant land rumored to contain valuable resources and powerful tribes. The earlier expeditions of Julius Caesar in 55 and 54 BC had already demonstrated that Britain could be reached and partially subdued. Although Caesar never completed a full conquest, his campaigns revealed the strategic possibilities of the island. Caesar's brief invasions had forced several British tribes to acknowledge Roman authority and pay tribute, but these arrangements did not last. Once Caesar withdrew his forces, the island returned to its independent tribal structure. Nevertheless, the knowledge gathered during those expeditions remained valuable to Roman strategists for decades. Roman merchants continued to travel between Britain and the European mainland, exchanging goods and information. Trade networks connected the island with the provinces of Gaul, bringing British leaders into increasing contact with Roman culture. Some tribes adopted Roman goods, customs, and political alliances, while others remained more resistant to outside influence. By the time Claudius became emperor, Britain was already partially connected to the Roman world through diplomacy and commerce. Yet it remained outside the formal boundaries of the empire. Conquering it would not only expand Roman territory but also provide a dramatic demonstration of imperial strength. For Claudius, this opportunity was particularly appealing. A successful invasion of Britain would accomplish several important goals at once. It would bring new lands and resources under Roman control. It would enhance the emperor's prestige among both the army and the Senate. And it would establish Claudius as a powerful ruler capable of continuing Rome's tradition of conquest. However, launching such a campaign was not a simple decision. Invasions required enormous resources, careful planning, and the support of experienced commanders. The Roman Empire possessed one of the most sophisticated military organizations in the ancient world, but even its legions could not conquer new territories without proper preparation. Claudius therefore began by consulting his advisors and military leaders. Roman generals studied the reports left by Caesar and gathered new intelligence from traders and diplomats who had recently traveled to Britain. They analyzed the political situation among the British tribes, looking for signs of division that could be exploited. The reports confirmed what many Roman leaders already suspected: Britain was politically fragmented. No single king or government controlled the entire island. Instead, dozens of tribes competed for power and influence. Some had friendly relations with Rome, while others were openly hostile. This fragmentation made Britain a tempting target. A united enemy could pose a serious challenge even for Rome's powerful legions, but a divided land could often be conquered piece by piece. The Romans had used this strategy successfully many times before. Throughout their history, they had expanded their empire by forming alliances with certain groups while defeating others. By supporting friendly tribes and isolating hostile ones, they could gradually extend their control over new regions. Britain seemed perfectly suited to this approach. Another factor also pushed Claudius toward the decision to invade. In the years leading up to the campaign, political tensions within Britain had begun to create opportunities for Roman intervention. Rival tribal leaders struggled for dominance, and some of them sought Roman support in their conflicts. By responding to these appeals, Rome could justify its involvement while gaining allies on the island. For Claudius, these developments made the invasion not only possible but politically advantageous. If the campaign succeeded, he would gain enormous prestige. If it failed, however, the consequences could be disastrous. Roman emperors were expected to deliver victory, not defeat. To maximize the chances of success, Claudius placed the command of the invasion in the hands of a capable and experienced general, Aulus Plautius. Plautius had already proven himself in previous military campaigns and was respected by the Roman army. His leadership would be crucial in organizing the invasion and guiding the legions through unfamiliar territory. Under Plautius, the Romans began assembling a powerful invasion force. Several legions were selected for the campaign, along with auxiliary troops recruited from across the empire. These auxiliaries included cavalry, archers, and specialized units trained for different types of combat. Together they formed a diverse and highly effective fighting force. The preparation for the invasion took time. Supplies had to be gathered, ships prepared, and soldiers trained for the challenges of fighting in a distant land. Roman engineers constructed equipment needed for crossing rivers, building fortifications, and maintaining supply lines once the army landed. While these preparations were underway, Claudius carefully managed the political narrative surrounding the campaign. He presented the invasion as a necessary and glorious expansion of Roman power, continuing the legacy of leaders like Julius Caesar. By framing the expedition in this way, he strengthened support for the operation among both the army and the Roman public. At the same time, Claudius understood the symbolic importance of the campaign. Conquering Britain would not only bring new territory into the empire but also demonstrate that even the distant lands beyond the sea were within Rome's reach. It would send a powerful message to both allies and enemies about the strength of Roman authority. As the invasion plans moved closer to completion, anticipation grew throughout the empire. Soldiers prepared to embark on a journey that would carry them beyond familiar frontiers. Commanders studied maps and intelligence reports describing the tribes and landscapes of Britain. Merchants and traders speculated about the new opportunities that Roman rule might create on the island. Meanwhile, the tribes of Britain remained largely unaware of the full scale of what was coming. Some leaders may have heard rumors of Roman preparations across the sea, but few could have imagined the size and organization of the army that was about to arrive. For Claudius, the invasion represented far more than a military expedition. It was the defining moment of his reign. Success would transform his reputation from that of an underestimated scholar into that of a conquering emperor. Failure could destroy his authority and plunge the empire into renewed instability. Everything now depended on the success of the campaign that was about to begin. In the early months of 43 AD, preparations for one of the most ambitious campaigns of the Roman Empire were nearing completion. After weeks of gathering troops, ships, supplies, and intelligence, Roman commanders were ready to launch an invasion that had been discussed for decades. The destination was the mysterious island of Britain, a land long known to Roman traders and explorers but never fully conquered. Now, under the orders of Emperor Claudius, the empire would attempt something far greater than the brief expeditions once led by Julius Caesar. The command of this massive undertaking fell to a capable and experienced Roman general named Aulus Plautius. Plautius was not the most famous commander in Roman history, but he was respected for his discipline, organization, and ability to manage complex military operations. Leading an invasion across the sea into unfamiliar territory required careful planning, and Plautius possessed the patience and strategic mindset necessary for such a challenge. The army assembled for the invasion was formidable by any standard of the ancient world. It consisted of 4 Roman legions, each made up of roughly 5,000 to 6,000 heavily trained soldiers. Alongside them marched thousands of auxiliary troops recruited from across the empire. These auxiliaries were not Roman citizens, but they served in specialized roles that complemented the power of the legions. Some were cavalry riders from the plains of Europe. Others were archers from eastern provinces skilled in ranged combat. Still others were light infantry accustomed to fighting in rough terrain. When all of these forces were combined, the total invasion army reached around 40,000 men. Although this number may seem small compared to the population of Britain, the strength of the Roman army did not lie in its size alone. It lay in its organization, discipline, and ability to function as a unified machine. Each Roman legion was a carefully structured unit divided into smaller formations called cohorts and centuries. Soldiers trained constantly to move, fight, and react together on the battlefield. Orders could travel quickly through the ranks, allowing commanders to adapt to changing conditions during combat. Unlike many tribal armies that formed temporarily around charismatic leaders, Roman legions were permanent professional forces. Every soldier knew his place, his duties, and the expectations placed upon him. Preparing such an army for an overseas invasion was a complex task. Thousands of soldiers had to be equipped with weapons, armor, and supplies. Food had to be stored and transported for the long journey ahead. Engineers prepared tools for building forts, bridges, and defensive structures once the army landed in Britain. Ships were gathered along the northern coast of the Roman province of Gaul, ready to carry the legions across the narrow but unpredictable waters of the English Channel. The crossing itself was one of the most dangerous parts of the campaign. The English Channel was known for its sudden storms and strong tides. Roman soldiers were experienced in warfare on land, but many had little experience traveling by sea. Transporting tens of thousands of troops, horses, weapons, and supplies across open water required careful coordination. The Roman fleet assembled for the invasion consisted of hundreds of vessels. Some were large transports designed to carry infantry and equipment. Others were smaller ships used for scouting, communication, and protection against potential attacks. Roman naval crews worked tirelessly to prepare the fleet for departure, ensuring that each vessel could handle the weight and distance required for the journey. As the army gathered along the coast, anticipation and tension filled the camps. Many soldiers had heard stories about Britain from merchants and veterans who had accompanied earlier expeditions. They imagined a distant land covered in forests and inhabited by fierce warriors who fought with wild courage. Some soldiers were excited by the prospect of glory and victory. Others felt uncertainty about the challenges that awaited them. Yet Roman discipline ensured that these emotions did not interfere with preparation. Training continued even as the ships were loaded and final plans were discussed. Officers drilled their troops in formation maneuvers and combat exercises, reinforcing the habits that would keep them alive in battle. Finally, the moment arrived for the fleet to depart. The ships carrying the Roman invasion force left the coast of Gaul and began their journey across the English Channel. For many soldiers, the sight of the open sea stretching toward the distant horizon must have been both thrilling and intimidating. Behind them lay the vast territories of the Roman Empire, with its cities, roads, and familiar landscapes. Ahead lay Britain, a land that, despite years of trade and diplomacy, still felt mysterious and unknown. The crossing was not entirely smooth. Ancient sources suggest that the fleet encountered delays and uncertainty during the voyage. Weather conditions and navigational challenges forced commanders to adjust their plans. Some accounts even mention that the soldiers initially hesitated to sail, worried about the dangers of the expedition. However, experienced officers and commanders eventually restored order and pushed the mission forward. After crossing the Channel, the Roman fleet approached the southeastern coast of Britain. The shoreline appeared as a series of cliffs, beaches, and low hills stretching into the distance. Somewhere beyond those hills lay the territories of powerful tribes who had ruled the region for generations. Among the most influential of these tribes were those led by the British princes Caratacus and Togodumnus. They were members of a powerful tribal dynasty that had expanded its influence across large parts of southeastern Britain. Their leadership had already brought several tribes together in resistance against Roman influence, and they now faced the challenge of defending their homeland against a full-scale invasion. News of the approaching Roman army spread quickly through the tribal territories. Messengers carried warnings between settlements and hill forts, urging warriors to gather and prepare for battle. Chiefs called upon their allies to unite against the foreign invaders who had crossed the sea. Although the tribes of Britain were often divided by rivalry, the arrival of the Roman army represented a threat that could not be ignored. Warriors from different tribes assembled to form a defensive coalition, determined to stop the Romans before they could establish a permanent foothold on the island. When the Roman ships finally reached the shore, the soldiers began the difficult process of landing their forces. Transport ships approached the beaches while smaller vessels carried troops closer to the coastline. Soldiers disembarked with their weapons, shields, and armor, forming defensive positions as soon as they stepped onto British soil. Landing an army in hostile territory was a dangerous operation. If the defending forces attacked while the soldiers were still disorganized, the entire invasion could collapse before it even began. Roman commanders therefore moved quickly to secure the landing area, establishing order among the troops and preparing for potential attacks. Once the initial landing was completed, the Roman army began to move inland. Their objective was not merely to defeat the British warriors in a single battle, but to establish a strategic presence that would allow them to expand their control step by step. Roman military strategy emphasized caution and organization. Rather than rushing recklessly into unknown territory, the legions advanced carefully, maintaining strong formations and protecting their supply lines. As the Romans marched deeper into Britain, they encountered resistance from the tribal coalition led by Caratacus and Togodumnus. The British warriors knew the terrain far better than the invaders. They understood the rivers, forests, and hills that shaped the landscape, and they used this knowledge to challenge the Roman advance. Despite their numerical advantage, however, the tribal forces faced a difficult opponent. Roman soldiers were trained to fight in disciplined formations that could withstand sudden attacks and maintain cohesion even under pressure. Their armor and shields provided strong protection, while their coordinated tactics allowed them to adapt to different types of terrain. One of the most significant challenges for the Romans during the early stages of the campaign was navigating the unfamiliar environment of Britain. The land was very different from the provinces where many of the soldiers had previously served. Dense forests, marshy ground, and winding rivers created obstacles that slowed the movement of large armies. Yet Roman engineers were experts at overcoming such challenges. As the army advanced, they built temporary roads, bridges, and camps to support their progress. Each evening, the soldiers constructed fortified camps surrounded by ditches and wooden walls. These camps provided safety during the night and served as logistical bases for the next stage of the march. This methodical approach allowed the Roman army to maintain control over its movements while gradually pushing deeper into British territory. Although the tribal warriors could launch sudden attacks, they struggled to break the disciplined formations of the legions. For the people of Britain, the sight of the Roman army must have been astonishing. Thousands of soldiers marching in organized ranks, their armor gleaming and their shields forming solid walls of defense, represented a style of warfare unlike anything most tribes had faced before. The Romans did not simply fight, they built, fortified, and advanced with relentless precision. As the campaign continued, it became clear that the conflict between Rome and the tribes of Britain would not be decided in a single battle. Instead, it would unfold through a series of confrontations as the Roman army attempted to secure its foothold and expand its influence across the island. The arrival of 40,000 Roman soldiers had begun a new chapter in the history of Britain. What started as a daring voyage across the English Channel was rapidly becoming a full-scale struggle for control of the island. The tribal coalition led by Caratacus and Togodumnus would soon face the challenge of confronting one of the most disciplined military forces the ancient world had ever seen. And the fate of Britain now depended on the outcome of that struggle. As the Roman army advanced deeper into the lands of Britain, the true strength of the invading force began to reveal itself. To many of the tribal warriors watching from hilltops and forests, the Roman soldiers appeared unlike any enemy they had faced before. They did not fight as scattered bands of individuals rushing into battle for personal glory. Instead, they moved as a tightly controlled and disciplined machine. Every soldier seemed to know exactly where to stand, when to move, and how to fight beside the man next to him. This level of coordination was the result of a military system that had been refined over centuries by the powerful Roman Empire. At the heart of Roman military power was the legion. Each legion was far more than just a group of soldiers. It was a permanent professional unit with its own identity, traditions, and structure. A typical legion contained roughly 5,000 heavy infantry soldiers, supported by officers, engineers, craftsmen, and logistical specialists. Every legion was divided into smaller formations that allowed commanders to control their troops with remarkable precision during battle. The backbone of this structure was the century, a unit of around 80 soldiers commanded by an experienced officer known as a centurion. Centurions were among the most respected figures in the Roman army. They were responsible for maintaining discipline, training soldiers, and leading their men directly into combat. Many had years of experience and had risen through the ranks by demonstrating courage and leadership on the battlefield. Several centuries formed a cohort, and multiple cohorts together made up the full legion. This layered organization allowed Roman commanders to adjust their tactics quickly. Units could be repositioned, reinforced, or withdrawn without causing confusion among the ranks. Compared to the more loosely organized tribal forces of Britain, this structure gave the Romans an enormous advantage in coordination and battlefield control. Training played a critical role in maintaining this effectiveness. Roman soldiers were not temporary warriors who fought only when their tribe or community was threatened. They were professionals who spent years preparing for the demands of warfare. From the moment a recruit joined the army, he was subjected to intense physical training and discipline. Soldiers marched long distances carrying heavy equipment, practiced combat drills repeatedly, and learned to build defensive structures quickly. Even the simplest movements were rehearsed again and again. Soldiers practiced forming defensive lines, advancing in formation, and responding to commands under stressful conditions. These drills ensured that every man understood his role within the larger system. When battle began, there was little hesitation or confusion. Orders passed down the chain of command were executed immediately and precisely. The equipment of the Roman legionary also reflected the empire's emphasis on efficiency and uniformity. Each soldier carried a short sword known as the gladius, designed for stabbing attacks during close combat. Unlike longer swords used by some tribal warriors, the gladius was ideal for fighting in tight formations where quick, controlled strikes were more effective than wide swings. In addition to the gladius, soldiers carried a heavy javelin called the pilum. The pilum was specially designed to disrupt enemy formations before close combat began. Roman soldiers would throw their pila just before engaging the enemy. The long metal shank of the weapon often bent upon impact, preventing enemies from throwing it back and making it difficult to remove from shields. This tactic could break the defensive lines of opposing forces and create openings for the legionaries to exploit. Perhaps the most iconic piece of Roman military equipment was the large rectangular shield known as the scutum. Made from layers of wood covered with leather and reinforced with metal, the scutum provided excellent protection against arrows, spears, and sword strikes. Soldiers could lock their shields together to form a solid defensive barrier that protected the entire formation. When Roman soldiers advanced in formation, their shields overlapped slightly, creating what appeared to be a moving wall. This wall could absorb enemy attacks while the soldiers behind it prepared to strike. The combination of shields and coordinated movement made Roman infantry extremely difficult to break. Armor also played an important role in protecting the legionaries. Many soldiers wore segmented metal armor that covered the torso while allowing enough flexibility for movement. Helmets protected the head and included cheek guards to shield the face. Although the armor added weight, Roman soldiers were trained to march and fight while carrying heavy loads. In addition to weapons and armor, each soldier carried tools and supplies necessary for building camps and fortifications. The Roman army was famous for its ability to construct defensive positions wherever it went. At the end of each day's march, soldiers would build a fortified camp surrounded by a ditch and wooden walls. These camps provided safety during the night and created a secure base for the army's operations. The ability to build such fortifications quickly was one of the reasons the Roman army could operate effectively in unfamiliar territory like Britain. Even when surrounded by potentially hostile tribes, the legions could create a protected environment where soldiers could rest, organize supplies, and prepare for the next stage of the campaign. While the legions formed the core of the Roman military, they were supported by auxiliary units that added versatility to the army. These auxiliaries were recruited from across the empire and often specialized in skills that complemented the heavy infantry. Some units consisted of cavalry riders who could scout ahead, pursue fleeing enemies, or protect the flanks of the legion. Others were archers capable of launching volleys of arrows from a distance. There were also auxiliary infantry trained to fight in rough terrain, where the heavy formations of the legions might struggle to maneuver. These troops were particularly useful in regions like Britain, where forests, hills, and marshlands could complicate traditional battlefield tactics. Together, the legions and auxiliaries formed a balanced military force capable of adapting to a wide range of challenges. Roman commanders could combine different units to create strategies suited to specific situations, whether defending a position, attacking enemy fortifications, or maneuvering through difficult landscapes. Discipline was the foundation that held this entire system together. Roman soldiers were expected to obey orders without hesitation, even in the most dangerous circumstances. Failure to maintain discipline could result in severe punishment. At the same time, acts of bravery and loyalty were rewarded with promotions, decorations, and sometimes even grants of land after retirement. This culture of strict discipline ensured that the Roman army functioned as a cohesive unit. Individual bravery was respected, but the success of the formation always took priority over personal glory. Soldiers were trained to protect their comrades and maintain the integrity of the line at all costs. When the Roman army encountered the tribal warriors of Britain, this disciplined approach often proved decisive. British warriors were courageous and skilled fighters, but their style of warfare emphasized individual heroism and sudden charges. Warriors often rushed forward to engage the enemy directly, seeking to prove their strength in personal combat. Against a disorganized opponent, such aggressive tactics could be effective. However, against the structured formations of the Roman legions, they often led to heavy losses. As British warriors charged forward, they were met by a wall of shields and coordinated strikes from Roman swords and spears. Even when the tribal forces outnumbered the Romans, they struggled to break the solid formations of the legions. Roman soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder, protecting each other and maintaining their lines even under intense pressure. The discipline drilled into them during years of training allowed them to remain calm and organized in the chaos of battle. Communication also played a crucial role in Roman battlefield effectiveness. Commanders used signals, horns, and standard bearers to relay orders across the ranks. Each legion carried distinctive banners and symbols that helped soldiers maintain their positions and follow commands during combat. Standard bearers, known as signifers, held a particularly important role. They carried the standards representing their units and served as focal points for the soldiers around them. Protecting these standards was a matter of honor, and losing one to the enemy was considered a terrible disgrace. As the Roman army advanced through Britain, this combination of discipline, equipment, and organization allowed them to confront forces that were often much larger in number. While tribal warriors relied on courage and familiarity with the land, the Romans relied on structure and coordination. In many ways, the Roman army functioned less like a collection of individuals and more like a single powerful organism. Each soldier was a small but essential part of a larger system designed to maintain order and deliver controlled violence when necessary. This system had been refined through generations of warfare across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. By the time the legions arrived in Britain, they represented one of the most advanced military forces the ancient world had ever seen. For the tribes of Britain, facing such a force presented an enormous challenge. Their warriors were brave and determined, but bravery alone could not easily overcome the organized might of the Roman war machine. As the campaign continued and battles loomed on the horizon, it became increasingly clear that the outcome of the invasion would depend not just on numbers or courage, but on the clash between two very different approaches to warfare, one rooted in tradition and tribal loyalty, and the other forged by the relentless discipline of the Roman military system. As the Roman army pushed deeper into the lands of Britain, the conflict between the invading legions and the tribal coalition defending the island began to intensify. Until this point, much of the campaign had consisted of careful advances, skirmishes, and cautious maneuvering. Roman commanders were determined not to rush blindly into unknown territory, while the British leaders attempted to gather their warriors and prepare a defense strong enough to stop the foreign army. Eventually, however, both sides would be drawn into a confrontation that would become one of the most decisive moments of the entire invasion. This confrontation took place near a river known today as the site of the Battle of the Medway. In the 1st century AD, the river formed a natural barrier across the landscape, flowing through a region that was strategically important for anyone attempting to control southeastern Britain. For the defending tribes, the river offered a strong defensive position. If they could prevent the Roman army from crossing, they might halt the invasion before it could expand further into their territory. Leading the resistance were the British princes Caratacus and his brother Togodumnus. Both were members of a powerful ruling family connected to one of the dominant tribal groups in the region. Over the years, their tribe had expanded its influence across neighboring territories, building alliances and gaining authority over other communities. Now, with the Roman army marching through their lands, these leaders faced the enormous challenge of defending their homeland against one of the most formidable military forces in the ancient world. Caratacus and Togodumnus gathered warriors from multiple tribes to form a defensive coalition. Messengers traveled between settlements and hill forts, calling upon chiefs and warriors to join the fight. Although the tribes of Britain often competed with one another, the Roman invasion posed a threat that demanded cooperation. Thousands of warriors answered the call, bringing their weapons, chariots, and determination to the river where the Romans would soon arrive. The landscape around the Medway River was well suited for defense. Rivers had long been used as natural barriers in warfare, forcing attackers to slow down and exposing them to attacks while attempting to cross. The British coalition positioned its warriors along the banks, preparing to strike as soon as the Romans attempted to advance. Chariots stood ready behind the front lines, their drivers prepared to race across the battlefield carrying warriors into combat. Meanwhile, the Roman army under the command of Aulus Claudius approached the river with caution. Claudius understood the danger of attacking a well-prepared enemy across a natural obstacle. Charging directly into the water while facing thousands of defenders could lead to heavy losses and chaos among the legions. Roman commanders therefore studied the terrain carefully before making their move. Scouts observed the positions of the British warriors and searched for weaknesses along the riverbanks. Engineers examined possible crossing points where the water might be shallow enough for soldiers to pass. For the Romans, patience was a critical part of strategy. Unlike tribal armies that sometimes rushed into battle driven by courage or anger, Roman generals preferred to analyze every situation and strike only when they believed the odds were in their favor. Eventually, the moment arrived when the Roman army began its attempt to cross the river. As the legions approached the water, the British warriors watched closely from their defensive positions. They knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for. If they could attack while the Romans were vulnerable in the water, they might shatter the invasion force before it could organize itself on the opposite bank. The first movements of Roman troops toward the river signaled the beginning of a fierce confrontation. British warriors surged forward to contest the crossing, launching attacks against soldiers attempting to advance through the water. Spears flew through the air, and the noise of battle echoed across the landscape. For many armies, Such a situation could quickly descend into chaos. Soldiers struggling through a river while facing an attacking enemy often lost formation and became easy targets. But the Roman legions were trained precisely for moments like this. Roman soldiers maintained their discipline even as they waded through the river. Shields were raised to block incoming weapons, and officers shouted commands to keep the formations intact. Step by step, the legions pushed forward against the resistance on the riverbank. One of the most dramatic moments of the battle came when Roman auxiliary troops executed a daring maneuver. These auxiliaries included soldiers trained for specialized tasks, and among them were warriors skilled at crossing rivers under combat conditions. Instead of attempting to cross only at the main points of attack, some of these troops swam across the river at unexpected locations. Carrying their weapons and shields, they moved quietly through the water until they reached the opposite bank behind the British lines. When they emerged, they launched a sudden assault against the defenders from the rear. This surprise attack created confusion among the British warriors. Instead of facing the Romans from one direction, they suddenly found enemies appearing behind them. The carefully organized defensive line began to falter as warriors turned to face this unexpected threat. At the same time, the main Roman force continued its push across the river. With the defenders distracted and disorganized, the legions were able to establish a foothold on the far bank. Once Roman soldiers gained solid ground, their disciplined formations began to take effect. The fighting did not end quickly. Historical accounts suggest that the battle lasted for an extended period, possibly stretching across 2 days of intense combat. Both sides fought fiercely, and the outcome remained uncertain for much of the struggle. British warriors launched repeated attacks against the Roman positions, hoping to push them back into the river. Chariots raced across the battlefield, carrying fighters who leapt into combat and then withdrew to regroup. The noise of clashing weapons and shouted commands filled the air as thousands of men struggled for control of the river crossing. Despite their courage, the British coalition gradually began to lose its advantage. Once the Roman army had successfully crossed the river and formed its battle lines, the strength of the legionary system became increasingly difficult to overcome. Roman soldiers advanced in disciplined formations, shields locked together and swords ready. Each movement was coordinated, each attack supported by the soldiers beside them. Even when individual fighters fell, the formation continued to move forward. The British warriors, by contrast, relied more heavily on individual combat and rapid charges. While these tactics could be devastating in certain circumstances, they were less effective against the organized ranks of Roman infantry. As the battle continued, the balance slowly shifted in favor of the invaders. During the fighting, tragedy struck the British leadership. Togodumnus, one of the key leaders of the resistance, was killed during the campaign that followed the battle. His death dealt a serious blow to the morale and unity of the defending tribes. Caratacus continued the struggle, but the loss of his brother weakened the coalition and made it harder to coordinate resistance across the region. With the British forces gradually pushed back, the Roman army secured control of the river crossing. This victory marked a turning point in the invasion of Britain. The Medway River had been one of the strongest natural defensive barriers protecting the southeastern territories of the island. Now that it had been breached, the path deeper into Britain lay open. Following their success, the Roman legions continued their advance toward one of the most important settlements in the region, Camulodunum. Camulodunum was a major center of power and influence among the tribes of southeastern Britain. Controlling it would provide the Romans with a strong base for further operations and send a powerful message about the strength of Roman authority. The capture of such an important location would also have enormous symbolic significance. It would demonstrate that the invading army was not merely conducting raids or temporary expeditions, but establishing permanent control over the territory. As news of the Roman victory at the Medway spread across Britain, different tribes faced difficult decisions. Some continued to resist, determined to defend their independence at any cost. Others began to consider the possibility of negotiation or alliance with the powerful newcomers. The battle had shown that the Roman army was not easily defeated. Even when confronted by larger numbers and challenging terrain, the legions could adapt, reorganize, and continue fighting until they achieved their objectives. For the Roman commanders, the victory confirmed that their strategy was working. By maintaining discipline, exploiting tactical opportunities, and gradually securing key locations, we will continue to move forward at a steady pace. They could weaken the resistance of the tribes and expand their control step by step. For the tribes of Britain, however, the battle marked the beginning of a long and difficult struggle. The defeat at the river demonstrated that stopping the Roman advance would require more than courage and numbers. It would require unity, coordination, and the ability to confront one of the most powerful military systems the ancient world had ever produced. And as the Roman army marched onward toward the heart of southeastern Britain, it became increasingly clear that the fate of the island was about to change forever. After the Roman victory near the Battle of the Medway, the balance of power in southeastern Britain began to shift dramatically. The tribal coalition that had tried to stop the Roman invasion had been shaken, and many of the defensive advantages that once protected the region had now been lost. With the river crossing secured, the Roman army under Aulus Plautius was able to continue its advance deeper into the territory controlled by some of the most powerful tribes on the island. For the Roman commanders, the next objective was clear. They needed to capture a major center of tribal authority that would allow them to establish a stable base for their growing presence in Britain. That target was Camulodunum, an important settlement that served as a political and cultural hub for one of the dominant tribal groups in southeastern Britain. Camulodunum was not a Roman-style city with stone buildings and paved streets. Instead, it was a large tribal settlement surrounded by defensive earthworks and connected to nearby communities through trade and alliances. For the tribes that lived in the surrounding lands, the settlement represented both power and tradition. Controlling it meant controlling the heart of regional authority. After their defeat near the Medway, the remaining British forces withdrew toward this stronghold, hoping to regroup and organize further resistance. Leading the continuing struggle was Caratacus, one of the most determined leaders among the tribes. Even after suffering setbacks, he remained committed to defending his homeland against the advancing Roman army. However, the loss of his brother Togodumnus, who had died during the campaign, dealt a severe blow to the unity of the tribal coalition. Togodumnus had been a respected leader, and his death weakened the alliance between different tribes that had joined together to resist the invasion. Without strong coordination, it became increasingly difficult for the defenders to organize large-scale resistance against the disciplined Roman legions. Meanwhile, the Roman army continued its methodical advance. Roman commanders understood that capturing Camulodunum would send a powerful signal to the rest of Britain. It would show that the invaders were not merely raiders who would eventually withdraw across the sea. Instead, they intended to remain, to govern, and to transform the region into a permanent part of the Roman Empire. As the legions moved closer to Camulodunum, Roman scouts surveyed the surrounding countryside while engineers prepared for potential sieges or defensive operations. Roman armies rarely rushed into battles without preparation. They studied the terrain, secured supply routes, and ensured that their soldiers were ready for any challenge. At the same time, messages were sent back across the sea to inform Emperor Claudius about the progress of the campaign. The reports were encouraging. The legions had successfully landed, defeated a major tribal coalition, and advanced toward one of the most important centers in southeastern Britain. For Claudius, this was exactly the kind of news he had hoped to receive. The emperor had launched the invasion not only to expand Roman territory but also to strengthen his own reputation as a powerful ruler. Although he had ordered the campaign and supported it from afar, he wanted to personally share in the glory of its success. With the Roman army approaching Camulodunum and the tribal resistance weakening, Claudius decided that the time had come to travel to Britain himself. The arrival of a Roman emperor in the middle of an active military campaign was a significant event. It demonstrated both confidence and authority. Claudius did not intend to spend long on the battlefield, but his presence would symbolically confirm that the conquest of Britain was an imperial achievement. When Claudius crossed the sea and joined the Roman forces in Britain, he did not come alone. He brought reinforcements, additional troops, and an extraordinary element that would leave a deep impression on the local population. Among the forces accompanying him were war elephants. For the tribes of Britain, elephants were creatures unlike anything they had ever seen. Towering above men and horses, these massive animals had been used in warfare in various parts of the ancient world for centuries. Their size, strength, and intimidating appearance made them powerful psychological weapons. As the Roman forces approached Camulodunum with elephants marching alongside their soldiers, the sight must have been both astonishing and terrifying for many of the defenders. Even experienced warriors could feel their confidence shaken by the appearance of such enormous beasts on the battlefield. Although elephants were not the primary weapon of the Roman army, their presence added a dramatic element to the campaign. They symbolized the vast reach and resources of the Roman Empire, a power capable of bringing animals from distant lands into battle, thousands of miles from their native habitats. With Claudius now present and the Roman army fully prepared, the final push toward Camulodunum began. The defenders attempted to organize resistance, but the earlier defeats and internal divisions among the tribes made sustained defense difficult. Some groups continued to fight while others began to reconsider their position. Faced with the overwhelming strength of the Roman army, certain tribal leaders chose to negotiate or submit rather than risk destruction. Eventually, Camulodunum fell under Roman control. This moment marked a turning point in the invasion of Britain. By capturing such an important settlement, the Romans established a strong foothold that would allow them to expand their influence further across the island. Camulodunum soon became the first major Roman administrative center in Britain, serving as a base for governance, trade, and military operations. For Claudius, the success of the campaign provided exactly what he had hoped for, a decisive victory that would strengthen his position as emperor. After overseeing the submission of several British leaders and ensuring that Roman authority was firmly established, he returned to Rome to celebrate the triumph. In Roman culture, military victories were often commemorated with grand celebrations known as triumphs. During these events, victorious commanders paraded through the streets of Rome with their troops, displaying captured treasures and prisoners while crowds cheered their achievements. Claudius received such honors for the conquest of Britain. The campaign had transformed his reputation from that of an underestimated ruler into that of a conquering emperor who had expanded the empire's borders. Yet while the emperor returned to Rome, the work of conquering Britain was far from finished. Although southeastern regions had fallen under Roman control, much of the island remained beyond the reach of Roman authority. Tribal leaders who refused to submit retreated into more distant territories, continuing their resistance from strongholds in the hills and forests. Among those who continued the struggle was Caratacus. Rather than surrendering after the fall of Camulodunum, he moved westward and continued to organize resistance against Roman expansion. For years he fought a determined campaign against the occupying forces, demonstrating that the spirit of independence among the tribes had not been completely extinguished. Roman commanders responded by gradually extending their control through a combination of military campaigns, diplomacy, and strategic construction. Forts were built across newly conquered territories, allowing Roman troops to maintain order and defend their positions. Roads connected these forts, enabling soldiers and supplies to move quickly across the landscape. Roman engineers played a crucial role in this transformation. They constructed bridges over rivers, roads through forests, and defensive walls around settlements. These structures allowed the Romans to maintain long-term control over areas that had once been difficult to access. As Roman influence expanded, new towns and cities began to appear across the region. Markets developed where traders could exchange goods, and Roman-style buildings gradually replaced older tribal structures in some areas. The landscape of Britain slowly began to change under the influence of Roman culture and administration. Despite these developments, resistance did not disappear completely. One of the most dramatic challenges to Roman authority would come several years later, when a powerful uprising was led by the warrior Queen Boudica. Her rebellion would nearly drive the Romans out of Britain entirely, destroying several Roman settlements and forcing the empire to fight desperately to regain control. Although the Romans eventually defeated the rebellion, the uprising demonstrated that Roman rule in Britain was never entirely secure. Maintaining control over the island required constant vigilance, strong leadership, and the continued presence of Roman legions. Nevertheless, over time, Roman authority became firmly established in large parts of Britain. The empire governed the island for nearly 4 centuries, leaving a lasting legacy in architecture, infrastructure, and culture. Roads built by Roman engineers continued to shape travel routes for centuries after the empire's departure. Cities founded during the Roman period grew into major centers that would influence later generations. Even the idea of Britain as a connected region was strengthened by the administrative systems introduced during Roman rule. Looking back, it is remarkable to consider how the transformation began. An island inhabited by nearly 2 million people, divided among dozens of tribes, had been brought under the control of an invading force of roughly 40,000 soldiers. The Romans did not achieve this through numbers alone. Their success came from discipline, organization, engineering skill, and the ability to exploit the divisions among their enemies. By carefully planning their invasion, maintaining strong formations in battle, and securing key locations like Camulodunum, the Roman army gradually turned its initial foothold into a lasting presence. The events of 43 AD therefore marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Britain. What began as a bold invasion ordered by Emperor Claudius would eventually reshape the island's political and cultural landscape for generations to come. As we come to the end of this journey, it becomes clear that the conquest of Britain in 43 AD was not simply a story about numbers. On the surface, it seems almost unbelievable that around 40,000 soldiers from the mighty Roman Empire could overcome a land inhabited by nearly 2 million people. But history often reminds us that victory is rarely determined by population alone. Organization, discipline, leadership, and strategy can sometimes outweigh sheer numbers. The Roman legions represented one of the most advanced military systems of the ancient world. Their soldiers were professionals who trained constantly, marched long distances with heavy equipment, and fought as part of carefully organized formations. Every movement on the battlefield was practiced, every command followed with precision. When these legions advanced together, they became more than just individual fighters. They became a coordinated machine built for conquest. At the same time, the tribes of Britain possessed their own strengths. Their warriors were brave, skilled in combat, and deeply connected to the lands they defended. Leaders such as Caratacus resisted Roman expansion with determination, continuing the struggle long after the first major battles were lost. And years later, the uprising led by Boudica would show that the spirit of resistance among the British people had never completely disappeared. Yet the Romans understood something crucial. They did not try to conquer the entire island in a single overwhelming assault. Instead, they advanced step by step, securing river crossings, capturing key settlements like Camulodunum, building forts, and extending their control gradually across the landscape. Each victory strengthened their position, allowing them to expand further into the island. Over time, the Roman presence began to transform Britain itself. Roads cut through forests and fields, connecting distant regions in ways that had never existed before. Forts and towns became centers of trade and administration. Roman culture, technology, and architecture slowly blended with local traditions, creating a new chapter in the island's history. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain would remain part of the Roman world. Even after the legions eventually withdrew, the influence of Rome could still be seen in the ruins of walls, roads, and cities scattered across the countryside. These remnants remind us that the events of 43 AD were not just a short campanethe, were the beginning of centuries of change. The story also teaches an important lesson about the nature of power. Empires rise not only through strength but through planning, adaptability, and the ability to exploit opportunities. The Romans succeeded in Britain because they combined military discipline with political strategy, taking advantage of divisions among their opponents while carefully building their own position. And that is what makes this moment in history so fascinating. It shows how a relatively small but highly organized force could reshape the destiny of an entire island and leave a legacy that would echo through the centuries. If you enjoyed exploring this chapter of ancient history, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us again as we continue uncovering the most remarkable stories from the past, stories of empires, battles, and the people who changed the course of history.